I'm Leon Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday Tone Tip. On today's video, I want to show you how I use the Axe-Fx 3 as the central hub in my home studio for all things related to guitar tones. I'm using it in a rack in combination with some vintage rack gear, some outboard pedals, and I also use it to run any guitar-related plug-in VSTs on my production computer. Let's dive straight in, and we'll start off with an example of how I use it to manage my old rack gear. For this setup, I'm using the Axe-Fx for my raw amp and cab tones. You can see I've got the ODS 100 clean amp model along with this free IR that I gave away on the channel a few weeks ago. I'm then using output 2 and output 4 to split that signal to my old rack effects. I've got an Eventide H3500, which is receiving the stereo outputs from output 2. The reason I've done that is the Eventide is pretty fussy, not only about the connections, but the level that it receives. So I'm taking the XLR outputs from output 2 on the Axe-Fx to the XLR inputs on the H3500. I've then got the output 2 control over on the right of the Axe-Fx that allows me to set up the optimal amount of input gain to the Eventide. I'm then using output 4 left to go to the mono input of the 2290 and output 4 right to go to the mono input of the PCM70. They're both mono in stereo out units, whereas Eventide is stereo in stereo out. Now, all of the stereo outputs of those units are coming back to this Samson SM10 mixer. What I like about this is it means I can send a single pair of outputs back to input 4 of the Axe-Fx, but it also means I've got these mute buttons over here. So if I want to toggle effects on and off with hardware, I can do that. Let's have a listen to the dry signal, then I'll bring in each unit. I'm currently using the Eventide for some stereo detune. I'm using a duct panning delay on the 2290, and I've got the awesome sounding rich plate reverb on the PCM70. This makes it so quick and easy to manage these old rack effects. Some of them are fussy about input and output levels. Some of them are a little bit noisy and hard to use, but they've got a great character, and some of them have some magical sounding presets that I just love being able to fire up. I do have a MIDI block set up in here so that I can send program changes to each of these units, but to be perfectly honest, I find myself using this manually most of the time. It's really satisfying to grab a hold of that big value wheel on the Eventide or to push the buttons on the 2290 to dial sounds in, and I've just kind of come to accept that I like using them that way, and I'm gonna leave it with that kind of setup. I don't need this to do gapless switching or anything like that. If I need any of those modern conveniences, I'm just gonna use the Axe-Fx on its own. So it might be a slightly clunky way to use this, but it is really satisfying. Let's hear those same sounds with some dirt now. It's definitely overkill, but it is so much fun and it's one of my guilty pleasures. If I'm being perfectly honest, I probably only fire up those rack units every other week, but when I do, it reminds me of some of my favorite guitar recordings, and it's also so much better than just having these units sitting in storage gathering dust. I've got a patch panel down here that is linked into input and output 3 of the Axe-Fx, and I use this to integrate external pedals into my setup. Now, I've got a VP4 down here, and the irony is the VP4 is so much more powerful on its own than this mixer and these 3 external rack units. And I've got the Axe-Fx here, so why do I need the VP4? Well, you can do things like running 4 multi-tap delays in parallel at the same time, which you can't even do on the Axe-Fx because of the block count. So I'm gonna let you hear this. Again, I'm going from output 3 of the Axe-Fx, and you can see on the grid over here, I'm just running a simple amp and cab. I'm then just coming back in series. There's no parallel mixing or anything going on over here. And if I want to, I can add a bunch of effects like reverbs, delays, and modulations to the VP4. So I can really go over the top with this modular setup. But for this setup, I'm using a bunch of the Alan Holdsworth UD Stomp inspired delays in parallel on the VP4. And it sounds pretty ridiculous. That sounds absolutely gorgeous running it with a volume pedal and the Ursa Major reverb. The VP4 makes such a great expansion module for something like the Axe-Fx, and in particular the AM4 or FM3. The last little setup I want to talk you through is just using the Axe-Fx to run external plugins in your DAW or on your computer. And this just means that I can run a blank preset on here and assign input 5 and input 6 to whatever plugin I'm using, but then route it back through the Axe-Fx. I fired up the Fractal Audio Icons Pasadena plugin. You can see I've actually got a totally blank preset on the Axe-Fx. I don't need to use any of the blocks over here, but in the Icons plugin settings, I'm using the Axe-Fx as the input and the output device. The input channel is set to input 5, which is just the raw DI from the guitar. I can run this at a super low latency on my computer. I'm using a Mac Studio and it can handle it just fine. And this is the main preset I use, which is virtually identical to the main preset that I use in the Axe-Fx or the FM9 when I play live. FAS Stealth Blue amp, I'm using my free cab IR, and I'll add some stereo delay, chorus, and pitch to this. The reverb that I'm using is the large plate. Now, I am using the Axe-Fx in this setup to use the plugin. The reason I like doing this is if I'm in a DAW and I want to reamp my signal really easily using this, I can just fire up the plugin rather than having to run the reamper to the Axe-Fx hardware. Let's hear it. And a hot tip, if you want to try and cop that PCM 70 style rich plate reverb, the deep chamber in the Axe-Fx or in the Pasadena plugin does a pretty good job of getting close to the overall vibe and character. I've just got this at Otherwise, stock settings, I've just adjusted the mix to taste on here for the Eventide style pitch. Basically, when you dial up this dual D tune in Pasadena, it is set in that sweet spot. I'm using this analog stereo delay on here. And, you know, if I didn't have my fractal with me and I just had a basic interface and my laptop, I can cop all of the tones that I've got in that entire rack using this plugin, which is pretty amazing. Another thing I like doing is using this with a VST host like Blue Cat Patchwork, which lets me run this with any of my other VST plugins. I'll give you an example. Here's that same FAS Stealth Blue preset. I've disabled the delay and the reverb, but I've still got the dual D tune on. I'm going to add the Valhalla delay plugin to that. Another greasy rack inspired plugin that I like is this Deep Z plugin from Temecula DSP. It's a recreation of the old Ensoniq DP Pro. I really hope you enjoyed taking a look at my home studio setup as well as all those greasy tones. If you're using a fractal in your home studio or in a professional setup, please let me know what you're using and how you're using it. If you've got any comments or suggestions for future Tuesday tone tips, pop them in the comment section below. My free IRs are also linked in the video description. Go and make some guitar noises for the rest of the week, and I will see you on the next Tuesday tone tip. Cheers.